Welcome to the Open Minds Show. I'm your host, Christopher Balkaran, and I'm trying to inject a level of political moderation into our hyperpolarized world. So if you're liking my content, definitely hit that like button, subscribe, share, tell all your friends. CNN is at it again. They're trying to figure out why the left needs their own Joe Rogan in the wake of the Donald Trump election victory. This is what they had to say.
Patrick, let's start with that idea. When people, if there are such people who say that they need a liberal Joe Rogan, what do you think they actually mean when they say that?
Well, I think the short answer is they do need a new Joe Rogan. The question is, what does that look like?
Yes, you do need a Joe Rogan, but before we get to why you need a Joe Rogan, let's talk about why so many young people have gravitated to podcasts over the past 5 to 10 years. And let's just back it up a little bit. We have to remember that millennials were the first generation who were sold, go to school, get your degree, get 2 degrees, and then you'll get this big job once you graduate after tens of thousands of dollars of student debt. And so we graduated with multiple degrees, and then we turned on the news and we saw how big topics that we studied in the schools that you sent us to were being covered in these very one-dimensional ways. Things that were so complex and convoluted were being whittled down into clear bias, in one-sided bias that included sound bites, and we saw that we were being lied to, especially on big issues. As well, there were issues that simply were not being covered at all by many, if not all, mainstream news outlets, that they were becoming a bit frumpy, a bit outdated, a bit, what's the word, not relevant anymore to our life and our lived experiences, that phrase that so many throw around. So what did most of us do? We went to podcasts of all places because they were these uninterrupted, free-flowing conversations with experts on topics we were genuinely curious about, that we talked about with our friends in our group chats, that mainstream media just didn't even think of covering because they were kooks, they were whack jobs, they were out there, they were ideas that had not even tried to survive. They were ideas that need to be done away with. And so what many of us did is we started listening to these podcasts and we went on our runs, we went for our bike rides, we went out with friends and we said, did you listen to that podcast with Andrew Huberman and Joe Rogan or Jordan Peterson and Joe? And we started having these more in-depth conversations, not from what we were hearing in the news, but what we were listening to on our podcasts, on Spotify, on our way to work, etc. That's why we gravitated to podcasts. They were this free-flowing conversation where we could explore all of our own questions and curiosities without judgment. And to be honest, I feel like mainstream media once was there. There once was mainstream media that had shows with free-flowing conversations. I remember watching debates from the 70s and 80s with William F. Buckley, and I thought, this is pretty cool. It's pretty interesting to see where this conversation's going. And then over time, mainstream media, you started with these sound bites, and you had guests on your shows that would just regurgitate soundbite after soundbite after soundbite. And there wasn't an engaging, informative, educational interaction. And surprisingly, that's what so many of us were craving. We were craving exactly that, a more thoughtful, engaging conversation. It's not like we rushed home every night and waited for Joe Rogan podcast to throw on his latest conversation and then listen to 3.5 hours. I would argue many of us only listened to the first 45 minutes or so. But it was that there were guests on that were of all different walks of life, and we were able to explore them in a truly curious manner. And I think CNN and so many others missed the boat, because as this was happening, the left went down this path of beating us over the head for being racists, misogynists, sexists who did not agree with their framing. And then they had politicians who furthered this message of being a racist or a xenophobe or a misogynist if you didn't agree with them. And so that drove more and more of us into podcasts, into longer form conversations, trusting YouTube more than cable news networks. But the reality is, so many just didn't seem to think that was useful for their networks. And this is a great example because this conversation right here really does exemplify exactly that. So we'll keep letting it play.
Things that are not, unfortunately, shows like ours right now, that are not shows of the competitors either. You have to find a way to break through that. And I think that for Democrats, largely their investments have been in ad buys and campaigns that are focused on media that the young people, that diverse voters just aren't in anymore.
I think Democrats need to find a message first. What is their message to voters? That I don't understand. Do they want to be the far left? Do they want to be moderate? Do they want to be, where do they want to land? I mean, it's so inauthentic to me to hear like, we need to find our own, how are we going to create somebody out of thin air? First, they need to find a message and figure out who they are and then figure all that
So
out.
it wasn't healthcare access. It wasn't housing affordability. It wasn't childcare affordability. It wasn't having, assistance in your home for the, that sandwich generation.
This is exactly why so many moved away from liberal and left-leaning media. This idea that your policies are moral and the other side is immoral is precisely why so many started getting turned off by liberals and Democrats in particular. You can't beat people over the head with morality and expect them to wake up the next morning and say, I'm going to be moral today. I'm going to vote Democrat because the other side is immoral and they're fundamentally wrong. That's not how people work. That's not how human psychology works. It doesn't work that way. In fact, most people can see through that framing of morality versus immorality. Instead, this is where I see the real opportunity for Democrats if they want to take it. The real opportunity is Trump is going to make mistakes as leader. He has before and he will again. That's a given. Don't focus on Trump in the lens of morality and immorality. Focus instead on what he said versus what he did. It's just that simple. Focus on what the man said he would do versus what he will do or hasn't done. The gaps that are bound to happen. He put in place Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy in charge of the Department of Government Efficiency. I guarantee you, they're going to find efficiencies, quote unquote, but they may not find as much efficiencies as they said they would. Great opportunity. They might find people retiring and some agencies coming together, but they're not going to do widespread cuts to the federal government because it actually doesn't work in their best interest for that to happen. Great opportunity. You said you do all these things, and yet you only did 20% of the things, 10% of the things. What happened to all that vigor, that I want to do all these things? You may even find that Elon Musk and Vivek have put forward more regulations or even tighter regulations in the defense sector. These are perfect examples where Democrats can call out the gaps in the rhetoric that they hear versus the action that is. And they can also call out some of the rhetoric they hear from RFK versus what happens as he heads up health. These are some examples that Democrats can do, but instead they go down these paths of morality, of fighting and helping your fellow American, and that's not how you're going to win over moderates. And the more they go down that path, the worse it's going to be. But let's keep this rolling because I find this to be so interesting.
None of those things.
Look, you guys are the one arguing all the time on TV and on radio and everywhere else about what the message is. I'm just saying they need to figure out the message. And then,
to be clear, Republicans argue about their message all the time. And I think I grew up with right-wing radio and obviously Rush Limbaugh. There's always been a robust right-wing media ecosystem. And the question I have is how much of this is actually about audience and what you will allow? Meaning, the campaign didn't let Kamala Harris sit for 3 hours. And I don't think the campaign would have put her in front of Theo Vaughn to talk about his cocaine habit.
And that's where a lot of people just really don't like the Democrats because there's the double standard. They talk about Theo Vaughn's drug habits. Like this guy, what's his name again? Obama's cocaine confessional won't blow his chances. Don't we remember Obama? Yeah, he openly admitted in his book that he, quote, used cocaine and marijuana in high school and college. He's made speeches about his cocaine addictions and how he wasn't being his true best full self and his potential. And yet Democrats turn a blind eye to Obama on so many of the foibles he made in his personal life, as well as his run as president. And again, when you're talking to millennials, you're talking to people with multiple degrees on average, went to college and university, and you're talking to us in a moral versus immoral state. And that's why so many are just tuning you out. Again, there's this thing I was reading somewhere that people are explicit with their opinions and then implicitly they hold a lot in. The Cato Institute said 62% of Americans are self-censoring themselves around others. 62%, I would say that number is probably underestimated. I would argue that perhaps it's even more. It's probably 80 or 90%. Because so many people are just inundated with politics brought up in a framing of morality versus immorality. And if someone says, oh, no one's going to have, someone sit down and talk about their cocaine addiction with a podcast host, Theo Vaughn, the podcast host, and not talk about the foibles of Barack Obama, that's where, again, you lose a lot of people. But what's also interesting is this clip from Anderson Cooper, which I just found so funny.
And I pushed her on that last night. I quizzed. I try to look at the policies from different, but she's got stated policies and you can look them up. Donald Trump does not have policies.
Oh, there you
Donald
go.
Trump,
That's what I'm talking about.
yeah, and we say, this is nothing new. We talk about this all the time. He doesn't have, he does not have his policy. In 2016, his policy for Iraq was taking Iraq's oil by using U.S. soldiers to surround the oil fields and extract the oil somehow and bring it to America. Literally, and I was like, that's not a thing. So that's been going on now. That's what
you just did. What you just did is what I would like to hear more pundits do, because
Kamala Harris has policies? You must be joking me. I know that clip was from October 25th, but you must be joking me. Kamala Harris does not have actual policies, folks. I actually read through her entire, quote, policy handbook, Economic Opportunity, A New Way Forward for the Middle Class. Folks, there's not many policies in here. If you read through it, if you truly read through it, there's actually no policies. There's a lot of conjecture and a lot of speech and a lot of speaking about what Trump did, et cetera, et cetera. But in terms of policies, and when I say policy, I mean state what you want to do and explain how you're going to do it. To me, that's a policy. There's not much. There's talks about tax cuts and tax credits for the middle class, but there's nothing here that kind of costs these out and talks about where that money is coming from. Folks, I actually went through it and this is what I found. Okay, so when it comes to healthcare, the document discusses expanding and making permanent tax credits and relieving medical debt, but there's no specifics on how this will actually be implemented, funded, or measured. As well, when it comes to energy costs, it says that the government will support lowering home energy costs through tax credits and unlocking upgrades to the electrical grid. But then it doesn't talk about how it's going to actually do that and where that money will come from. 1.2 million in new affordable rental homes. But it doesn't explain how the expansion will be implemented or where the additional funding will come from reallocating existing resources or new appropriations. These are a lot of conjecture pieces that Kamala has put forward or did put forward in her policy book, but they're not policies. And what's so odd is that Anderson Cooper talks about it as if they are fully baked policy. And that's where I think a lot of legacy media struggles with our age group in particular. They don't recognize how intelligible we are as a group of people. And so that's why you're getting more and more people online talking about this. So I just wanted to highlight that and some of the wildness that exists online in CNN. So if I could say one thing, the left does need to find their own Joe Rogan, but you need to be open to discussing things that are not being discussed find the gaps in the Trump administration, because there will be, and also don't insult people's intelligence. We don't like looking at things from a moral versus immoral lens, and we don't like thinking of this from that perspective either. But let me know what you think in the comments below. Do you agree with this analysis? Let me know, and I will definitely catch you in the next one.